In the sleepy village of St. Mary's Mead, a single gunshot echoes through the brewery's shadowy cellar, felling Thomas Brewer, master of his craft. Was it his wife, hiding bruises and secrets behind a locked desk? His ambitious partner, chasing a London deal? The nervous worker, caught in a web of sabotage? Or the rival, his boots stained with foreign mud, as whispers of spoiled ale and hidden debts swirl? Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and piercing eyes, unravels a tapestry of spite, fear, and betrayal, stitching together clues to reveal a killer hiding in plain sight. One shot, 4 suspects, and a truth that bubbles up like a poisoned brew who pulled the trigger. Chapter 1. The Cellar's echo. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary's Mead, softening the outlines of its thatched cottages and lending the village an air of timeless serenity. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking with the rhythm of a well-practiced waltz, a tremor of disquiet rippled through the usual calm. The source was Lily, her young maid, who burst through the door with cheeks flushed and eyes wide as saucers, her apron slightly askew from haste. "Oh, ma'am, it's dreadful," she gasped, clutching the edge of the tea table. "Mr. Brewer, Thomas Brewer of the brewery, he's been shot dead in his own cellar." Miss Marple's needles paused, hovering like delicate sentinels over the half-formed scarf in her lap, her mild blue eyes, deceptively soft behind her spectacles, fixed on Lily with a quiet intensity that belied her frail appearance. "Shot, you say?" she murmured, her voice gentle but threaded with a keen curiosity. "In the cellar, of all places? Dear me, how very shocking. Tell me, Lily, what have you heard?" Lily, eager to unburden herself, sank into a chair, her words tumbling out like pebbles in a stream. Her brother, Tom, worked at Brewer's Best Ales, the pride of St. Mary's Mead, and had been at the brewery when the body was found. "It was just past dawn," she said, "when the head cooper, old Mr. Dawkins, had gone to check the oak barrels in the cellar and stumbled upon Mr. Brewer, sprawled among the casks, a dark stain spreading across his waistcoat. The doctor, summoned in haste, confirmed a single bullet had pierced his heart. The village constable, out of his depth, had sent for Inspector Craddock from Much Benham, and now the brewery buzzed with whispers as thick as the yeast in its vats. Miss Marple listened, her fingers resuming their knitting with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if each stitch anchored a thought. Thomas Brewer, she knew, was no ordinary man. His ales, crafted with a near-alchemical precision, had won prizes at county fairs and secured contracts with grand taverns in London. His brewery, a stout stone building on the village's edge, was a source of local pride, though not without its envies. "And who," she asked, her tone as light as a summer breeze, "was seen about the brewery last night?" Tom must have mentioned something. Lily hesitated, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her apron. "Well, ma'am," Tom said, "Mr. Brewer was there late, as he often was. Checking the brews. Mrs. Brewer, Margaret, his wife, was at home, or so she says. Then there's Mr. Cutler, the partner, who was at the Red Lion till late, talking business. Ned Riley, one of the workers, was cleaning up a spill in the brewhouse, and, oh ma'am, that Silas Holt from Lower Wick was seen skulking about the lane, though he denies it." Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not of amusement, but of recognition. She had lived long enough in St. Mary's Mead to know that beneath its placid surface, human passions simmer: jealousy, greed, fear, all as potent as the hops in Brewer's ales. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a farmer's prize ram was poisoned, and the culprit proved to be a neighbor nursing a grudge over a mere half-aka. A cellar, she mused aloud, is a private place. Lily, a place for secrets, perhaps. I think I shall take a walk to the brewery this afternoon, with some scones for the workers. Grief, you know, often loosens tongues. Lily nodded, Though her expression suggested she thought scones an odd remedy for murder, Miss Marple, however, knew better. She rose, setting her knitting aside, and adjusted her straw hat with its modest ribbon. The brewery was not far, a pleasant stroll past the vicarage in the green, but her mind was already there. Sifting through the names, Margaret, Cutler, Ned, Silas, each a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. As she stepped into the misty lane, the church clock chimed 10, its notes echoing like a warning across the village. Murder, Miss Marple thought, was a clumsy stitch in the fabric of life, but one she was determined to unravel. Chapter 2. The brewer's world. The sun had burned away the morning mist by the time Miss Jane Marple approached the brewery, her black lace mittens gripping a wicker basket filled with freshly baked scones, their buttery scent a quiet offering to a house of mourning. Brewer's Best Ales stood at the edge of St. Mary's Mead, its stone walls weathered by decades of rain and its chimney puffing faint wisps of steam, a sign that work, however grim the circumstances, pressed on. The brewery was the village's beating heart, its vats producing amber liquid that warmed throats from local pubs to distant cities. Yet today, an undercurrent of unease pulsed beneath its usual hum, as palpable as the tang of malt in the air. Miss Marple paused at the iron gate, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. Workmen moved with subdued purpose, their boots scuffing the cobbled yard, while a constable stood sentinel at the cellar door, his young face stiff with importance. She noted the brewery's orderly chaos, stacks of oak barrels, their hoops, gleaming sacks of barley piled against a wall, and a cart laden with empty bottles, waiting to be filled. But there was something else, a faint sourness in the air, not the rich, yeasty warmth she expected. Her nose wrinkled slightly, and she filed the observation away, much as she might tuck a stray thread into her knitting bag, inside the brewhouse. She was met by Inspector Craddock, a lean man in his 30s, whose brisk manner softened at the sight of her. He had learned, through past cases in St. Mary's Mead, to respect the elderly spinster's unerring knack for seeing what others missed. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat, "I might have known you'd turn up. Come to offer condolences, I suppose." His tone held a trace of amusement, but his eyes were weary, shadowed by the weight of a murder unsolved. "Condolences? Yes," she replied, her voice mild as she lifted the cloth from her basket, revealing golden scones, and perhaps a word with those who knew poor Mr. Brewer best. "A village tragedy touches us all, Inspector." She offered a scone, which he declined with a polite shake of his head, and she sensed his impatience to return to the cellar, where the crime had unfolded. Craddock led her through the brewhouse, a cavernous space where copper vats gleamed under the high rafters. The air was warm, heavy with the sweet bitter scent of fermenting wort, though that sour note lingered, faint, but persistent. Workers glanced up, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion, but none approached. Miss Marple's presence, with her neat hat and basket, seemed to them an odd intrusion, like a sparrow in a hawk's nest. Yet she moved with quiet assurance, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, noting a spilled sack of hops, a broom propped carelessly against a wall, and a ledger left open on a wooden bench, its pages fluttering in a draught. "The facts, Miss Marple, are these," Craddock began, guiding her toward the cellar stairs. "Thomas Brewer was shot last night, between 10 and midnight, we reckon. A single bullet, straight to the heart, from a revolver we haven't yet found. He was found this morning by Dawkins, the cooper, lying among the barrels down there." He gestured to the heavy oak door, its iron hinges rusted, but sturdy. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry. Whoever did it was someone he knew, or at least someone he didn't fear enough to lock the door against. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already spinning threads. "A cellar is a private place, Inspector," she said softly. "One does not wander into it by chance. And Mr. Brewer, I understand, was a man of habit, often working late." "Exactly so," Craddock confirmed, His wife says he was checking the brews, as he did most nights. The man lived for his ale, by all accounts. But he had enemies, at least, those with reason to wish him ill. He lowered his voice, though the nearest worker was well out of earshot. We've 4 in our sights: Margaret Brewer, his wife; James Cutler, his business partner; Ned Riley, a lad who works here; and Silas Holt, that brewer from Lower Wick. Each was seen near the brewery last night, and none has an alibi that holds water. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained grave. 4 threads, Inspector, each with its own knot to untangle. Tell me, what do we know of them? She stepped closer to the cellar door, peering down the stone steps into the shadowed depths, where a constable's lantern cast flickering light on the barrels. Craddock sighed, rubbing his jaw. Margaret Brewer claims she was at home, reading, by the fire, but no one can vouch for her. She's a quiet sort, devoted to Thomas, or so the village says, but— He hesitated, then added, there's talk of strain between them. Nothing overt, mind, but you know how villages talk. Miss Marple did indeed know. She thought of Mrs. Price, who years ago had smiled serenely at church, while her husband's temper left marks none dared mention. And Mr. Cutler, she prompted, her fingers brushing the basket's handle. James Cutler's the money man, Craddock said. Handles the accounts, pushes for expansion. He says he was at the Red Lion till 11, discussing a deal with the supplier, but the memory is foggy on the timing. Cutler's ambitious, and Thomas's caution, well, it didn't sit well with him. He glanced at the ledger on the bench, and Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the neat columns of figures, interrupted by a smudge of ink. Ned Riley. Now Craddock continued, he's a young worker, barely 20. Bit of a shifty sort, always fidgeting. He was here late, cleaning up a spill, he says, but left by 10. No one saw him go, and he lives alone in a room above the baker's. Not much to go on, but he's nervous, and that's something. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Nervousness, she knew, could mean guilt or merely fear of being misunderstood. She recalled young Tommy Pierce, who had trembled under questioning for a stolen pie, though his crime was only hunger. And Silas Holt? She asked, her voice as soft as the rustle of her skirt. Holt's the rival, Craddock said, his tone hardening. Runs a brewery in Lower Wick, smaller but scrappy. He and Thomas were at odds over a big London contract. Holt lost, and he's not one to take defeat lightly. He was seen in the lane near here last night, though he claims he was in Lower Wick, drinking with friends. Those friends, of course, swear he never left their side. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the names into a pattern. Margaret, with her quiet demeanor and unverified evening. Cutler, with his ambitions and vague alibi. Ned, with his nervous hands and late-night task. Silas, with his grudge and convenient friends. Each was a figure in the village's tapestry, their threads crossing in ways yet unseen. She stepped toward the cellar door, her small frame dwarfed by its heavy oak, and peered into the gloom. Might I see where it happened, Inspector? A scone or two for your men, perhaps, while I look. Craddock hesitated, then nodded, sensing her request was no idle curiosity. He led her down the narrow steps, the air growing cooler and damper with each descent. The cellar was a vast, shadowed chamber, its stone walls lined with barrels stacked, like silent sentinels. The lantern light revealed a chalk outline where Thomas Brewer had fallen, near a barrel marked with a faint X in white chalk. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, then moved to the floor, where a faint smear of mud caught her attention, not the red clay of the brewery yard, but a darker, loamier sort, as if carried from elsewhere. No signs of a scuffle, Craddock said, pointing to the undisturbed barrels. He was standing here, likely facing his killer. The shot was close, the doctor says, but not point blank. Whoever it was, Brewer didn't expect trouble. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting faintly, and examined the mud. Curious, she murmured, that the floor is so clean, save for this. A careful man, our Mr. Brewer, yet someone brought the outside in. She rose, brushing her hands, and offered the basket to the constable nearby, who took a scone with a shy grin. And the barrels, Inspector, were they all as they should be? Craddock frowned, catching her drift. We haven't checked them all, but Dawkins said one batch was off sour, he called it. Meant to be poured out today. Why, do you think it matters? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. Everything matters, Inspector, until it doesn't. A brewery is a living thing. You know its heart is in its brews. If something was amiss, it might tell us more than the bullet itself. She glanced at the X on the barrel, her mind flicking to a long-ago incident when a village baker's flour was tainted, not by accident but by spite. Might I speak with Dawkins, perhaps? Or one of the others? Craddock agreed, leading her back to the brewhouse, where old Dawkins was stacking empty casks. The cooper was a gnarled man, his hands calloused from years of shaping wood, his eyes red-rimmed from grief or lack of sleep. Mr. Brewer was a good master, he said gruffly, accepting a scone. Knew his craft better than any. Stayed late, always tasting, always tinkering. Last night, he sent me home at 9, said he'd lock up. And Ned Riley? Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Was he here when you left? Dawkins scratched his beard. Aye, mopping up a spill in the brewhouse. Clumsy lad, always knocking things over. But he was gone when I locked the yard gate, or so I thought. His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the hesitation, filing it away like a dropped stitch. She thanked him, her eyes lingering on the ledger as they passed it again. The smudge of ink was fresh, she noted, and the page showed a list of deliveries. With one entry scratched out, a delivery to London, marked delayed. She made no comment, but her mind buzzed. A delayed delivery, a sour batch, a smear of foreign mud. These were not the neat stitches of a brewery running smoothly. Something, or someone, had pulled a thread loose. As she stepped into the yard. The sour smell followed her, stronger now in the warming air. She paused by the gate, where a cluster of workers whispered, their glances darting toward the cellar. One, a broad-shouldered man with a cap pulled low, caught her eye and quickly looked away. Miss Marple's lips twitched. She knew that look: guilt, fear, or perhaps just the weight of knowing too much. In St. Mary's Mead, she had seen it on the face of a grocer who shortchanged his customers, and on a girl who hid a forbidden letter. The brewery, she sensed, held more than ale in its shadows. Inspector, she said, turning to Craddock, I shall return tomorrow, perhaps, with more scones. But do keep an eye on that ledger, and perhaps the mud on your men's boots. Small things, you know, can unravel the largest secrets. She smiled, her eyes as bright as the polished copper vats, and set off down the lane, her basket lighter, but her mind heavy with the threads of a murder, yet to be woven into truth. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Brewer residence, casting intricate shadows across the parlor's polished floorboards. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat perched neatly on her head and her basket now lighter by several scones, stepped into the room with the quiet grace of one accustomed to being overlooked yet seeing all. Margaret Brewer, the widow, rose from a chintz armchair to greet her, her movements slow, as if weighed by grief or something heavier. She was a slight woman, nearing 50, with fine features that might once have been called handsome, but were now drawn, her eyes shadowed and her chestnut hair streaked with silver. Her black morning dress, though well cut, seemed to wear her rather than the reverse, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in her hands as she gestured to a seat. Miss Marple, how kind of you to call, Margaret said, her voice soft but steady, with the practiced courtesy of one used to hosting. I'm afraid I'm poor company today. The shock, you understand. She trailed off, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief, its edges frayed from nervous handling. Miss Marple settled into the offered chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and offered a sympathetic smile. My dear Mrs. Brewer, no one expects you to be otherwise. A loss so sudden, so cruel, it would shake anyone. I've brought a few scones, though I know they're small comfort. She lifted the cloth from her basket, revealing the remaining pastries, their golden crusts, a stark contrast to the somber room. Margaret's lips flickered in a faint smile, but it did not reach her eyes. You're very thoughtful. Would you take tea? I can ring for Mary. She reached for a silver bell on the side table, but Miss Marple waved a gentle hand. No need, my dear, I shan't stay long. I only wished to offer my condolences and see how you fare. The village is all abuzz, you know, and one hears such varied accounts. Her tone was light, almost gossipy, but her eyes were keen. Noting the slight stiffening of Margaret's shoulders, they sat in silence for a moment. The only sound, the ticking of a mahogany clock on the mantel, its pendulum swinging with relentless precision. Miss Marple's gaze wandered the room, taking in the details: a vase of wilting roses, a bookshelf heavy with tomes on botany and brewing, a photograph of a younger Thomas and Margaret, their smiles unshadowed. But her attention lingered on a small desk in the corner, its roll top locked, a tiny brass key dangling from Margaret's chatelaine, glinting as it caught the light. And there, on Margaret's wrist, peeking from beneath a laced cuff, was a faint bruise, purple as a storm cloud, its edges fading but unmistakable. The village does talk, Margaret said at last, her voice low. They say Thomas was shot in the cellar, alone. I can't bear to think of it. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, her eyes glistening, though no tears fell. He was a good man, Miss Marple, devoted to his brewery, to his craft, perhaps too devoted, at times. Her words held a faint edge, like a blade wrapped in silk. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the handle of her basket. A man so consumed by his work must leave others feeling neglected, perhaps. It's not uncommon, I find, in men of such passion. Her tone was gentle, inviting confidence, as she had once coaxed a confession from a shy seamstress who hid her heartbreak behind a needle. Margaret's eyes flickered, meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before darting away. Thomas was not neglectful, she said quickly, too quickly. He was preoccupied. The brewery was his life. These past months, he was there more than here, tasting, testing, always chasing perfection. I understood, of course. I always understood. Her fingers tightened on the handkerchief, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor, the way the bruise seemed to pulse against the pale skin. Of course, Miss Marple murmured, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. And last night, you were here, I believe, alone, with your book. She tilted her head, her eyes soft but unyielding, like sunlight piercing fog. Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the carpet's floral pattern. Yes, I was reading a novel, nothing important. I heard the church clock strike 10, then 11. I thought Thomas would be home soon, but her voice broke, and she pressed the handkerchief to her eyes. He never came. Miss Marple's heart softened, but her mind remained sharp. She thought of Mrs. Ellison, a widow in St. Mary's Mead, who had sat in a similar parlor, claiming solitude while her hands betrayed a secret meeting, and no one called. No visitors to disturb your evening, she asked, her tone as casual as if inquiring about the weather. No one, Margaret said firmly. Mary, our maid, was in her room by 9. The house was quiet. She paused, then added, I wish now I'd gone to him, to the brewery. Perhaps I could have. She stopped, her lips trembling, and Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. You mustn't blame yourself, my dear, she said. These things are beyond our control. But tell me, was Thomas troubled of late? A man so dedicated might have worries others wouldn't see. She watched Margaret closely, noting the faint flush that crept into her cheeks. He was himself, Margaret replied, her voice steadying. The brewery was thriving, though there were pressures. Mr. Cutler wanted to expand, to sell to a larger firm. Thomas resisted. He said it would ruin the craft, turn his ales into something common. Her tone held a trace of pride, but also something else, resentment perhaps, or weariness. Miss Marple's eyes strayed again to the locked desk, its polished surface reflecting the dim light. A man of principle, she said softly. Such men often make enemies, even without meaning to. And you, Mrs. Brewer, did you share his view? She asked it lightly, as if merely curious, but her gaze lingered on the bruise, the key, the tightly clasped hands. Margaret hesitated, her fingers stilling on the handkerchief. I trusted Thomas's judgment, she said at last. He knew what was best for the brewery. I kept the home, that was my part. Her voice was flat, as if reciting a lesson learned by rote, and Miss Marple sensed a wall, carefully built, behind which something lay hidden. The clock chimed the quarter hour, and Margaret started slightly, as if roused from a trance. Forgive me, Miss Marple, I'm keeping you. You've been so kind. She rose, smoothing her dress, and Miss Marple followed suit, her movements slow and deliberate. Not at all, Miss Marple said, retrieving her basket. I shall call again, perhaps, when you're feeling stronger, and if you remember anything, any small thing, it might help the inspector. The smallest thread, you know, can unravel the whole. She smiled, her eyes crinkling, but they lingered on the bruise, the key, the desk, each a stitch in a pattern not yet clear. As she stepped into the lane, the air was sharp with the scent of autumn leaves, and the brewery's chimney loomed in the distance, a silent witness to the night's tragedy. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind turning over Margaret's words, her hesitations, her guarded manner. She thought of the bruise, so carefully hidden, and the locked desk, so carefully guarded. In St. Mary's Mead, she had known women like Margaret, women who smiled through pain, who locked away secrets as tightly as their hearts. She recalled Mrs. Turner, who had worn long sleeves to hide marks left by a husband's temper, and whose diary, found after her death, told a tale no one suspected. Secrets. Miss Marple murmured to herself, her steps light on the cobblestones. And a brewery, of all places, is full of them fermenting, waiting to bubble over. She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock again, to suggest a closer look at that desk, and perhaps at the brewery's ledgers, where secrets might be written in ink as black as morning. The widow's tale, she knew, was only the beginning, and in its silences lay the threads of a truth yet to be woven. Chapter 4. The partner's ambition. The late afternoon light slanted across the brewery yard, gilding the cobblestones and casting long shadows from the stacked barrels. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat slightly tilted from her walk, approached the brewery office with the same unhurried grace that had carried her through countless village inquiries. Her basket, now nearly empty of scones, swung lightly at her side, a prop as much as a gift, lending her the air of a kindly neighbor rather than a keen observer of human frailty. The office, a small annex to the brewhouse, was a world of order amid the brewery's controlled chaos. A polished oak desk, shelves lined with ledgers, and a single window overlooking the yard, its panes smudged with the dust of industry. James Cutler, Thomas Brewer's business partner, stood behind the desk, his broad shoulders filling a well-tailored jacket that spoke of prosperity, if not taste. He was a man in his 40s, with a ruddy complexion and a merchant's easy smile, though his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a mind ever tallying profits and risks. As Miss Marple entered, he set down a pen and rose, his manner cordial, but tinged with impatience, as if her visit were a distraction from weightier matters. Miss Marple, he greeted, his voice booming in the small room. A pleasure, though I'm sure you'll understand we're all at 6s and 7s here. Poor Thomas's loss has us reeling. He gestured to a chair, its cushion worn but clean, and she settled into it, her knitting bag at her feet, her eyes noting the papers strewn across the desk, contracts, invoices, and a map marked with delivery routes. "I quite understand, Mr. Cutler," she said, her tone soft as a summer breeze. "A tragedy like this disrupts everything. I only wished to offer my sympathies and see how the brewery fares." Thomas was the heart of it, was he not? She tilted her head, her spectacles catching the light, and watched his reaction. Cutler's smile tightened, though it held. He was indeed a genius with ale, Thomas. His recipes put Brewer's best on the map: London taverns, county fairs, even talk of exports. I handled the business side, of course, kept the wheels turning. He leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "Despite the cool room, of course," she murmured, her hands folded over her basket. "It must have been a partnership of balance his craft, your commerce. Though, I imagine such different temperaments led to disagreements." Her question was gentle, almost idle, but her eyes were as sharp as her knitting needles, catching the flicker of unease in Cutler's face. He laughed, a short, forced sound. "Disagreements? Nothing serious. Thomas was stubborn, mind you. Loved his barrels more than his balance sheets. I pushed for growth, new markets, bigger contracts, but he wanted to keep things small, artisanal, he called it." His tone carried a hint of scorn, quickly masked. "We'd have sorted it out. Always." "Did?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the desk, where a contract lay open, its letterhead bearing the crest of a London firm. "Expansion is a bold step," she said. "I recall old Mr. Hargreaves, who ran the bakery in St. Mary's Mead. He dreamed of selling his loaves in the city, but his partner thought it would ruin the bread's soul. They parted ways, in the end." She paused, letting the story hang, and watched Cutler's fingers still on the desk. "Well, we weren't parting ways," he said quickly. "Thomas and I built this together. His death, it's a blow, but the brewery will go on, has to." He shuffled the papers, as if to dismiss the topic, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided hers. "And last night?" she asked, her voice as soft as ever. "You were at the Red Lion, I believe, discussing business. The village is full of talk, you know, and one hears such varied accounts." She smiled, her eyes crinkling, but they held his gaze, unyielding as a needle through cloth. Cutler cleared his throat, his smile returning but thinner now. "Yes, at the Red Lion till near 11. Talking with a supplier, Mr. Grayson, from Much Benham. We were sorting out a barley shipment. Dull stuff, but necessary." He leaned forward, as if to emphasize his candor, but Miss Marple's mind snagged on the detail. The innkeeper, she recalled from Craddock's report, had been vague about the time, mentioning Cutler's presence, but not his departure. 11 is late for such talks," she remarked, her tone light. "But then, business waits for no man, does it? And you came straight home after." She tilted her head, her fingers brushing the basket's handle, as if the question were mere curiosity. Cutler hesitated, just a fraction too long. "Straight home, yes. My wife can confirm it. I was in by 11:30, no later." His voice was firm, but his eyes flicked to the window, where the yard bustled with workers. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting a young man, Ned Riley, perhaps, carrying a sack, his cap pulled low. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and offered a scone from her basket. "For your troubles, Mr. Cutler, and do forgive my chatter. In a village like ours, one can't help but wonder about such things." She paused, her eyes lingering on the contract, its terms dense with figures. "That paper looks important. A new venture, perhaps." Cutler's hand moved to cover the contract, a reflex he quickly masked with a smile. Just business as usual. Orders to fill, now that Thomas is gone. He took the scone, setting it on the desk, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers lingered on the paper, as if shielding it from view. As she stepped into the yard, the air was sharp with the scent of malt, but that sour undercurrent lingered, like a note out of tune. She paused by a stack of barrels, her eyes scanning the ground, where a faint scuff of mud caught her attention, not the red clay of the yard, but a darker loam, like that in the cellar. She thought of Cutler's polished shoes, gleaming as if newly cleaned, and her mind turned to Mr. Clements, a village shopkeeper who had once scrubbed his boots to hide a midnight errand. Ambition, she knew, could drive a man to great lengths, and Cutler's talk of expansion hinted at a hunger that Thomas's caution might have thwarted. She made her way to the gate, where Inspector Craddock was speaking with a constable. "Miss Marple," he called, striding over. "Any insights from our Mr. Cutler?" His tone was half teasing, but his eyes were keen, knowing her visits were never idle, only thoughts. "Inspector," she replied, her smile enigmatic. "Mr. Cutler is a man of ambition, and ambition can be a restless bedfellow. You might ask the innkeeper again about last night's timings, and perhaps look at the brewery's books. Figures, you know, can tell stories as plainly as words." She nodded toward the office, where Cutler's silhouette was visible through the window, his head bent over the desk. Craddock's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "I'll do that. And you, Miss Marple, back to your knitting." His smile was genuine now, though tempered by the weight of the case. "Oh yes," she said, her eyes twinkling. "But knitting, Inspector, is all about patterns, and I fancy I see one forming here. A thread or two, perhaps, but enough to start." She turned down the lane, her steps light but purposeful, her mind weaving Cutler's words, his hesitations, his polished shoes into the growing tapestry of the brewery's secrets. Ambition, she thought, was a fire that could warm a man's dreams or burn them to ash, and in James Cutler, she sensed a flame that flickered dangerously close to the edge. Chapter 5. The Worker's Shadow. The brewery yard, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, buzzed with the subdued rhythm of work, continuing despite the pall of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat casting a faint shadow on the cobblestones, lingered near the brewhouse door, her basket now empty of scones, but heavy with the weight of her observations. The air carried the familiar sweetness of malt, yet that persistent sour note, like a discordant chord, pricked at her senses, urging her to look beyond the gleaming vats and bustling workers. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, sought out Ned Riley, the young brewery worker whose nervous demeanor had already snagged a thread in her mind's tapestry. Ned was at the far end of the brewhouse, his wiry frame bent over a copper vat, polishing its surface with a rag that seemed more prop than tool. His movements were quick, almost furtive, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the cellar door, as if it held some unspoken dread. She approached with her usual unhurried grace, her skirt rustling softly, her smile as gentle as a village breeze. "Good afternoon, Ned," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of a neighborly chat. "Such a sad day for the brewery, is it not? I thought I might have a word, if you're not too busy." Ned started, nearly dropping his rag, his freckled face flushing under a mop of sandy hair. "Miss Marple," he mumbled, straightening up. "Didn't see you there. It's a sad day, right enough." His hands fidgeted, twisting the rag, and she noticed a faint stain on his cuff, dark, possibly ink, though its edges suggested something less benign. "I'm just cleaning, you know. Got to keep things shiny." "Indeed," she replied, her eyes crinkling with kindness. "A brewery is a place of pride, and you do your part admirably." Poor Mr. Brewer must have valued such dedication. She paused, letting the silence settle, a technique she had perfected in countless parlor conversations. Ned's gaze flicked to the floor, and she noted the tension in his shoulders. Like a rabbit poised to bolt. He was a good master, Ned said at last, his voice low. Knew his ales, Mr. Brewer did. Always checking, tasting, making sure everything was just so. He scrubbed the vat harder, though its surface already gleamed, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to young Willie Stokes, a gardener's boy who had polished tools with similar fervor to avoid questions about a stolen apple. You were here late last night, I understand, she said, her tone as casual as if asking about the weather. Cleaning up a spill, was it? Such a tedious task, but necessary, I'm sure. She tilted her head, her spectacles catching the light, and watched his reaction. Ned's hands stilled, and his eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, before darting away. A spill. Wort, from one of the vats. Clumsy of me, it was. I stayed. Till 10, mopping up, then went home. His words came too quickly, tripping over each other, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice, the way his fingers tightened on the rag. 10 o'clock, she murmured, as if merely confirming. And Mr. Brewer was here, I suppose, tending to his brews. A man so devoted must have been a sight to see, working late among his barrels. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on the stain, its dark edge stark against the white cuff. He was alive when I left, Ned said sharply, then caught himself, his flush deepening. I mean, he was in the cellar, checking the casks. I heard him moving about, but I didn't see him, not proper. I just left. His voice faltered, and he turned back to the vat, scrubbing with renewed vigor. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded over her knitting bag. Of course, my dear boy. No one expects you to have stayed longer than needed, though it must have been unsettling, being here so late, with the brewery so quiet. She paused, her mind turning to the sour smell, the marked barrel in the cellar. The mud that didn't belong. Tell me, Ned, do you know much about the brewing itself? The recipes? The process? It's such a fascinating craft. Ned's shoulders stiffened, and he hesitated, his rag slowing. Not much, ma'am. I'm just a worker cleaning, hauling, that sort. Mr. Brewer and Mr. Dawkins, they know new recipes. I just do what I'm told. His answer was, halting, his knowledge thinner than she expected for one employed in such a place. She thought of Tommy Pierce again, who had claimed ignorance of a garden's layout to hide his pilfering. I see, she said, her tone as gentle as ever. Well, you do your part, and that's what matters. Though I did hear something curious about a batch of ale gone sour. Such a pity, in a place like this. She watched him closely, noting the way his hand froze, the rag dangling limply. Sour, he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. I wouldn't know about that. Mr. Dawkins handles the tasting. He turned away, his movements jerky, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained as she stepped back. Into the yard, she overheard Ned muttering to another worker, a burly man with a cap pulled low. Ruined batches, Ned said, his voice low and urgent. Can't let it get out. The other man grunted, glancing over his shoulder, and Miss Marple filed the words away, like a dropped stitch, to be picked up later. She thought of a dairymaid in St. Mary's Mead, who had whispered of spoiled milk to hide her own tampering, and whose guilt had been betrayed by just such a muttered phrase. She found Inspector Craddock near the cellar door, his notebook open, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple, he said, looking up. You've been chatting with young Ned, I see. Anything to report? His tone was light, but his eyes were keen, sensing her knack for uncovering what lay beneath the surface. Only observations, Inspector, she replied, her voice soft. Ned is a nervous boy, and nervous boys often have reasons. You might ask about that spill he was cleaning, and perhaps check his cuff sink, he says. But stains can tell tales. And that sour batch, Inspector, it's worth a closer look. A brewery's heart is its ale. and a wound there might point to the hand that struck it. She smiled, her eyes twinkling, but her words carried the weight of certainty. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. I'll have a word with him, and the barrel we're testing it now. Dawkins says it's spoiled, but not naturally. Sabotaged, perhaps. He glanced at her, half expecting her to nod knowingly, but she only adjusted her hat, her expression serene, as she left the brewery. The sun dipping low, Miss Marple's mind wove Ned's words, his nervous hands, his thin knowledge, into the growing pattern. A worker who knew little of his craft, a stain that might not be ink. A muttered fear of ruined bitches. These were threads, small but telling, in the tapestry of Thomas Brewer's death. She thought of the cellar, the marked barrel, the mud that didn't belong, and sensed a shadow moving through the brewery, one that Ned Riley, with his twitching hands, might well have cast. Chapter 6. The rivals grudged the road to Lower Wick wound through fields of golden stubble, the late summer sun casting a warm glow over the hedgerows that separated St. Mary's Mead from its neighboring village. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a hired trap driven by young Tommy Pierce, who had long since outgrown his apple-stealing days, clutched her knitting bag as the cart jostled along. Her mission was to visit Silas Holt, Thomas Brewer's rival, whose brewery in Lower Wick had been overshadowed by Brewer's best ales. The sour note in the brewery air, the marked barrel, and Ned Riley's nervous mutterings lingered in her mind, but now her thoughts turned to Holt, whose grudge against Thomas was the talk of both villages. A man with a grievance, she knew from long experience, could be as dangerous as a storm brewing on a clear day. Lower Wick's brewery was a smaller affair than Brewer's best, its stone walls blackened by years of chimney smoke, its yard cluttered with crates rather than orderly barrels. The air here was sharp with the scent of roasted barley, free of the sour undercurrent that had troubled Miss Marple in St. Mary's Mead. As Tommy helped her down from the trap, she noted the brewery's modest bustle, a handful of workers, a cart loaded with bottles, and a single chimney puffing steadily. It was a place fighting to hold its own, and she sensed the weight of that struggle in the very stones. Silas Holt met her at the brewhouse door, a burly man with a face like weathered oak, his graying beard framing a scowl that seemed permanent. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms muscled from years of hefting barrels, and his voice, when he spoke, was a low growl, like gravel underfoot. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Heard you were poking about in St. Mary's Mead. Come to poke here too, I reckon." His tone was gruff, but his eyes, sharp and wary, betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "I've come to offer my sympathies." "Mr. Holt," she replied, her voice as gentle as a village stream. "Thomas Brewer's death is a loss to the craft, and I thought to pay my respects to those who shared his trade." She lifted the cloth from her basket, revealing a few remaining scones, their golden crusts a small peace offering. "May I sit a moment?" The journey was rather bumpy. Holt's scowl softened, though only slightly, and he gestured to a wooden bench inside the brewhouse, where a single vat bubbled quietly. "Sit, if you like," he said, taking a scone but setting it aside, as if food were an afterthought. "Thomas and I weren't friends, mind. No use pretending. But I didn't wish him dead, whatever the gossips say." He leaned against a workbench, his arms crossed, his boots caked with dark mud that caught Miss Marple's eye mud, unlike the red clay of St. Mary's Mead, but eerily similar to the smear she'd seen in Brewer's cellar. She settled on the bench, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes taking in the brewhouse. Clean, efficient, but lacking the polish of Brewer's best. A row of bottles stood on a shelf, their labels bold but simple, and a ledger lay open nearby, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "A brewery is a demanding mistress," she said, her tone light. "I imagine you and Mr. Brewer had much in common, despite your differences." Such a pity about that London contract, though. The village says it caused some friction. She tilted her head, her spectacles glinting, her smile as disarming as a grandmother's. Holt's jaw tightened, and he snorted, a sound like a kettle on the boil. Friction. That's a polite way of putting it. Thomas played dirty. Miss Marple outbid me for that contract with tricks undercutting prices, spreading tales about my ale. My brewery's smaller, but my stout's as good as his, and he knew it. He slammed a fist on the workbench, the bottles rattling. Lost me a year's profit, that contract did. But I didn't shoot him, if that's what you're fishing for. Miss Marple's hands folded over her bag, her expression serene. Oh, I fish for nothing, Mr. Holt. I only listen, and the village talks. So, they say you were seen near Brewer's Best last night, in the lane by the brewery. A long way to come for a stroll, surely. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her eyes held his. Unyielding as a needle through wool, Holt's face darkened, and he shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the floor. I was in Lower Wick, at the Black Bull, drinking with my mates. Ask MJB, Carter, and Will Pike. They'll tell you I never left till midnight. His voice was defiant, but Miss Marple noted the way his hands clenched, the mud on his boots flaking slightly, as if freshly dried from a recent journey. Of course, she said, her smile unwavering. Friends are loyal, are they not? I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead, years ago, when a young man's friend swore he was at cards all evening, only to find he'd slipped out for an hour. Loyalty can blur the truth. Sometimes. She paused, letting the story settle, and watched Holt's eyes narrow, though he said nothing. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and glanced at the ledger, its pages listing deliveries to local inns. Your brewery seems thriving, Mr. Holt, despite the lost contract. Your ale must be a comfort to many. Do you ever visit St. Mary's Mead? To share it, perhaps. Her question was innocent, but her gaze lingered on his boots. The mud, a silent witness to a path not yet explained. Holt grunted, his scowl returning. I keep to my own patch. No need to traipse to St. Mary's Mead. Not when Thomas was stealing my trade. He picked up a tankard from the workbench, polishing it with unnecessary vigor, and Miss Marple noted the care in his movements, the pride in his craft, despite his bitterness. As she stepped into the yard, she thanked him for his time, her basket, lighter, but her mind heavier with threads. The mud on Holt's boots, the vehemence of his grudge, the loyalty of his friends, these were stitches in a pattern, but not yet the whole cloth. She thought of Mr. Grayson, a St. Mary's Mead butcher, who had sworn vengeance on arrival, only to be found innocent when his anger proved louder than his actions. Holt's temper was real, but was it deadly? She wasn't sure. Tommy Pierce waited with the trap, and as she climbed in, she glanced back at the brewery. Its chimney, a stark silhouette against the sky. To the Black Bull, Tommy, she said, softly, and mind you, drive slowly. I've a thought to test Mr. Holt's story. The lad nodded, flicking the reins, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the tavern, where Jeb Carter and Will Pike might hold the key to Holt's alibi or its unraveling. At the Black Bull, a low-ceilinged inn with smoke-stained beams, she found the two men nursing pints in a corner. They were rough sorts, their faces weathered by labor, their loyalty to Holt as thick as the ale in their mugs. Silas was here till midnight, Jeb Carter said, his voice firm, echoed by Will Pike's nod. Never left, not once. But Miss Marple, sipping a weak tea offered by the barmaid, noted the way their eyes slid past hers, the rehearsed cadence of their words. She thought of the village choir, whose members once swore a boy was at practice only for a broken clock, to betray their lie. As she left the inn, the evening air, cool and sharp, Miss Marple's thoughts wove Holt's grudge, his muddy boots, his too-perfect alibi, into the growing tapestry. A rival's anger could burn hot, she knew, but it took cunning to pull a trigger and slip away unseen. Silas Holt, with his blunt manner and loyal friends, might be a storm cloud, but was he the lightning? She resolved to tell Inspector Craddock about the mud, and perhaps to check the lane by Brewer's best 4 tracks that matched. The rival's grudge was a thread, bold and coarse, but the pattern of Thomas Brewer's death was still taking shape, and Miss Marple knew the smallest stitch could unravel it all. Chapter 7. The spoiled brew. The morning air in St. Mary's Mead carried a crisp edge, the scent of dew-soaked grass mingling with the faint, ever-present aroma of malt from the brewery. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat firmly pinned and her knitting bag tucked under her arm, made her way back to Brewer's best ales, her steps deliberate, despite the uneven cobblestones. The brewery loomed ahead, its stone walls solid but somber, as if the building itself mourned its master. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her bag, turned over the threads she had gathered. Margaret's bruise, Cutler's ambition, Ned's nervousness, Holt's grudge. Yet it was the sour smell in the brewhouse, and the barrel marked with an X in the cellar, that tugged most insistently at her thoughts. Something was amiss in the brewery's heart, and she sensed it was no mere accident. Inspector Craddock met her at the yard gate, his face etched with the fatigue of a man wrestling with too few answers. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation. "I should have known you'd be back. More scones, or more questions?" His eyes crinkled with a faint smile, but his notebook, clutched in one hand, suggested his mind was elsewhere. "No scones today, Inspector," she replied, her voice as gentle as a village breeze. "But questions, perhaps. I've been thinking about that sour batch you mentioned. Such a curious thing in a place like this. Might I see the cellar again? I fancy there's more to learn from those barrels." Her eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, and Craddock, accustomed to her unerring instincts, nodded without protest. He led her through the brewhouse, where workers moved with the quiet efficiency of routine, though their glances betrayed unease. The sour smell lingered, fainter today, but unmistakable, and Miss Marple's nose wrinkled as she passed a stack of sacks, their burlap marked with faint stains. The cellar door stood open, guarded by a young constable who stepped aside at Craddock's nod. The stone steps descended into cool, damp shadows, and Miss Marple followed carefully, her hand steady on the iron rail, her mind alert to every detail. The cellar was, as she remembered, a vast, vaulted chamber, its walls lined with oak barrels, their hoops glinting in the lantern light. The chalk outline of Thomas Brewer's body was still visible, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the brewery's rhythm. Miss Marple's eyes sought the barrel marked with an X, its surface unremarkable, save for that single, deliberate mark. "This one, Inspector," she said softly, pointing. "You said it was spoiled. Might we open it?" Craddock raised an eyebrow, but signaled to a worker nearby, who fetched a mallet and chisel. The barrel's head was pried open, releasing a sharp, acrid stench that made the constable wince. Miss Marple leaned forward, her handkerchief pressed lightly to her nose, and peered inside. The ale was clouded, its surface marred by a thin, unnatural film, like oil on water. "Not just sour," Craddock muttered, his face grim. "Dawkins called it sabotage. Someone tampered with this batch vinegar, maybe, or worse." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Sabotage is a spiteful act, Inspector. It speaks of anger, or fear, or perhaps a need to hide something larger." She thought of a St. Mary's Mead gardener, years ago, who had poisoned a rival's roses to mask his own theft of cuttings. "Who had access to this barrel, do you?" "No." Craddock gestured to the worker, a grizzled man named Harris, who lingered near the stairs. "Anyone working late, ma'am?" Harris said, his voice rough. "Mr. Brewer, Mr. Cutler, Ned Riley, even old Dawkins. The cellar's locked at night, but the keys kept in the brewhouse, easy enough to grab." His eyes flicked to the barrel, then away, as if it held a secret He'd rather not know. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the barrel, then to the floor, where the faint smear of dark mud still lingered, untouched by the morning's sweep. And this mud, she said, almost to herself. Not from the yard, I think. Have you traced it, Inspector? She knelt, her knees protesting, and examined the smear, its texture distinct from the red clay outside. It matched, she realized, the mud on Silas Holt's boots, and perhaps the faint trace she'd seen near Ned's workstation. Craddock frowned, jotting a note. We're checking the lanes, but it's slow work. This mud's from further afield, Lower Wick, maybe, or the woods beyond. Holt's boots were caked with it, you said? He glanced at her, catching the thread of her thought. Indeed, she replied, rising with care, though mud alone proves little. But this barrel, Inspector, it's a wound in the brewery's heart. Someone wanted to hurt Mr. Brewer's work, and perhaps his death was the final stroke. Her eyes scanned the cellar, noting the orderly rows of barrels, the absence of disturbance, save for that one marked cask. She thought of Ned's muttered words about ruined batches, and the stain on his cuff, and her mind began to stitch a pattern. She followed Craddock back to the brewhouse, where the workers' subdued chatter fell silent at their approach. Miss Marple paused by the open ledger she'd seen before, its pages still smudged with ink. A new entry caught her eye, a note about a delayed delivery, scratched out with a heavy hand. Inspector, she said softly, might you look at this ledger? A delayed delivery, in a brewery so precise, seems curious. Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp, catching the way Harris, lingering nearby, shifted uneasily. Craddock flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. This is Cutler's writing, he said. A shipment to London, held back for quality concerns, matches the timing of the sour batch. He glanced at Miss Marple, his expression thoughtful. You think it's connected? Everything is connected, Inspector, she replied, her smile enigmatic. A brewery is like a village. Every act, every choice, leaves a trace. This spoiled brew, this delayed shipment, their threads, and someone pulled them loose. She thought of Mrs. Carter, who had once hidden a spoiled batch of preserves to avoid scandal, only for her deception to unravel under scrutiny. As they stepped into the yard, the sun was climbing, casting harsh light on the cobblestones. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the workers, their faces a mix of weariness and wariness. She spotted Ned Riley in the distance, hauling a sack, his cap pulled low, his movements quick and furtive. Young Ned, she murmured, seems troubled by more than grief. You might ask him about this barrel, Inspector, and watch his hands when he answers. They speak, you know, when words falter. Craddock nodded, his notebook snapping shut. I'll have him in for questioning, and we'll test that barrel's contents properly. Could be our killer thought to cover their tracks with a ruin brew. He hesitated, then added, You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. If I didn't know better, I'd think you'd solved it already. She laughed softly, adjusting her hat. Oh, no, Inspector. I only see threads, not the whole cloth. But a spoiled brew, like a spoiled secret, has a way of bubbling up. Keep an eye on that mud, and perhaps the key to the cellar. Small things, you know, make the largest patterns. She turned down the lane, her steps light but purposeful, her mind weaving the sour smell. The marked barrel, Ned's mutterings, and the foreign mud into a tapestry still incomplete. Sabotage, she knew, was a coward's weapon, but murder was a bolder stroke, and in the brewery's shadows, she sensed the two were entwined. Chapter 8. The locked desk. The soft glow of late morning filtered through the Brewer residence's parlor windows, where dust motes danced in the shafts of light, lending the room an air of suspended time. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat resting on a side table and her knitting bag at her feet, sat once more across from Margaret Brewer, whose pale face and black mourning dress seemed to absorb the room's warmth. The widow's hands, clasped tightly in her lap, held no handkerchief today, but the faint bruise on her wrist remained, a silent mark that Miss Marple's keen eyes did not miss. The mahogany clock on the mantel ticked with steady insistence, its rhythm a counterpoint to the tension that hung between the two women. Miss Marple had returned, ostensibly to offer further condolences, but her true purpose was the locked desk. In the corner, its brass key glinting at Margaret's waist, a small beacon of secrets yet to be uncovered. "My dear Mrs. Brewer," Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as the rustle of her skirt, "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought, to see how you're bearing up, with all this sorrow upon you." She leaned forward slightly, her spectacles catching the light, her smile warm but probing, like a needle seeking a loose thread. Margaret's lips curved in a faint, practiced smile, though her eyes remained shadowed. "You're very kind, Miss Marple. It's difficult, of course, but one manages. The village has been generous with their sympathies." Her fingers brushed the key at her chatelaine, reflex she quickly masked by smoothing her dress. Miss Marple noted the gesture, her mind flicking to Mrs. Langley, a St. Mary's Mead widow who had guarded her late husband's letters with similar vigilance, only for them to reveal a betrayal none suspected. "I'm glad to hear it," Miss Marple said, her hands folded over her knitting bag. "A village rallies in times of loss, though it can be overwhelming, all those eyes and whispers. I understand you were alone the night of the tragedy, reading by the fire." Her tone was conversational, but her eyes lingered on the desk, its roll-top shut tight, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on a wilting rose in the vase nearby. "Yes, alone. I read until late, past 11, I think." The house was so quiet without Thomas. Her voice caught, but her hands remained still, as if schooled to betray nothing. "I keep expecting him to walk through the door, you know, with that smell of malt on his clothes." Miss Marple's heart softened, but her mind remained sharp. "How well I understand," she murmured. "My own nephew, Raymond, once said a house feels emptiest when it's waiting for someone who won't return. And Thomas, with his brewery, such a legacy. I heard there was talk of a sale to a London firm, perhaps. It must have weighed on him." She tilted her head, her eyes drifting to the desk, where a faint scratch marred the wood near the lock, as if it had been forced once, long ago. Margaret's fingers twitched, brushing the key again. "There was talk," she admitted, her voice low. "James Meister Cutler pushed for it, said it would secure our future. Thomas wouldn't hear of it. He said it would turn his ales into something soulless, like factory swill." Her tone held, a trace of pride, but also a weariness, as if the argument had been rehearsed too many times. "Men and their principles," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle. "They can be as stubborn as old oak. And you, my dear, did you take a side in such matters?" Her question was light, but her gaze was steady, noting the way Margaret's eyes flickered toward the desk, then away. "I left business to Thomas," Margaret said quickly. "My place was here, keeping the home. He knew what was best for the brewery." Her words were firm, but her fingers tightened on her skirt, and Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Turner, whose locked drawer had hidden not just letters, but debts that threatened her family's name. "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising as if to leave. "But forgive an old woman's curiosity, might I trouble you for a glass of water? The walk was warm, and I'm not as young as I was." She smiled, her eyes crinkling, and Margaret, relieved by the change of topic, rang the bell for Mary, the maid, as Margaret stepped to the door to speak with the girl. Miss Marple moved closer to the desk, her movements slow but deliberate. The key at Margaret's waist was a small thing, but its presence was a magnet, drawing her thoughts. She recalled Inspector Craddock's mention of a delayed shipment, and Ned's muttered fear of ruined batches, and wondered what papers such a desk might hold. A faint smell of ash caught her attention, and she glanced at the fireplace, where a few charred fragments lay in the grate, their edges curled like secrets burned in haste. When Margaret returned, followed by Mary with a tray, Miss Marple was back in her chair, her expression serene. "Such a lovely desk," she remarked, sipping the water. "Thomas's, I presume. A man so meticulous must have kept his records there." Her tone was casual, but her eyes watched Margaret's reaction, noting the slight stiffening of her shoulders. "Yes, his," Margaret said, her voice tight. "Bills, accounts, that sort of thing. I haven't had the heart to look at them yet." She touched the key again, her fingers lingering, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to the scratched lock, the burned fragments, the bruise that spoke of more than a careless bump. "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, setting down her glass, "though the inspector might find those papers useful to understand the brewery's state. A business, you know, can hold as many secrets as a heart." She rose, retrieving her hat, and smiled. "I shan't keep you, my dear. But if you feel able, a glance at that desk might ease your mind, and perhaps the inspector's." Margaret's eyes widened, but she nodded, her hand closing over the key. "I'll consider it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As Miss Marple stepped into the hall, she heard the faint click of the key being turned, as if Margaret feared the desk might open of its own accord. Outside, the sun was high, and Miss Marple made her way to the village green, where she found Inspector Craddock speaking with a constable. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his notebook open. "You've been with Mrs. Brewer, I take it? Anything to add to our puzzle?" "Only a thought, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft. "That desk in the parlor's locked, and Mrs. Brewer guards the key like a treasure. There's a letter, I suspect, or perhaps accounts, that might tell us more. And the fireplace there are burned papers there, not entirely consumed, small things, but they weave a pattern." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "And do ask about that bruise on her wrist. It's not my place to say, but it's there, and it speaks." Craddock's brow furrowed, but he nodded, jotting a note. "I'll get a warrant for the desk, if need be. And the bruise, I noticed it too, but she brushed it off. You think it's tied to the murder?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think, Inspector, that a bruise is like a spoiled batch of ale-lit hints at something deeper, something hidden. Check the desk and the ashes, and watch Mrs. Brewer's hands when you ask. They'll tell you what her words won't." She adjusted her hat and turned down the lane, her mind weaving the locked desk, the burned fragments, the guarded key into the tapestry of Thomas Brewer's death. Secrets, she knew, were like stitches pull one, and the whole cloth might unravel. Chapter 9. The Worker's Secret. The ancient stones of St. Mary's Mead's Church glowed softly in the early evening light, their weathered surfaces a testament to centuries of village secrets whispered within its walls. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat slightly askew from a brisk walk, stepped into the cool shadowed nave, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. She had chosen the church for her meeting with Ned Riley, sensing that its solemn quiet might loosen the tongue of a young man whose nervous hands and muttered fears had already marked him as a thread in the brewery's dark tapestry. The air was heavy with the scent of old hymnals and beeswax, and the stained glass windows cast jewel-like patterns across the pews, lending an air of sanctity that Miss Marple hoped would encourage truth. Ned was already there, perched on the edge of a pew near the back, his wiry frame hunched, as if bearing an invisible burden. His cap lay beside him, and his fingers twisted a frayed thread on his jacket, the stain on his cuff still dark, still ambiguous, sketching the dim light. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his freckled face paling, his eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating flight. "Miss Marple," he mumbled, rising awkwardly. "You wanted to see me? I ain't done nothing, I swear." "My dear boy," she said, her voice as gentle as the rustle of leaves, No one is accusing you. I only thought a quiet word, away from the brewery's bustle, might do us both good. She settled onto the pew, her movements slow and deliberate, and gestured for him to sit. Such a sad business, Mr. Brewer's death. It must weigh heavily on you, working so close to him. Her eyes, soft behind her spectacles, held his with a kindness that belied their sharpness. Ned sat, his hands still fidgeting, his gaze fixed on the stone floor. "It's awful, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Mr. Brewer was strict, but fair. I just cleaned and hauled, did what I was told. Never thought I'd see him dead like that." His words were halting, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened, the stain on his cuff seeming darker in the church's gloom. She nodded, her hands folded over her knitting bag, her smile encouraging. "Of course, Ned, a brewery is a demanding place, and you've done your part. Though I did hear something curious about a batch of ale gone sour, marked with an X in the cellar. Such a pity, when Mr. Brewer took such pride in his craft." Her tone was light, but her eyes watched his reaction, noting the sudden stillness in his hands, the way his breath caught. "Sour?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know nothing about that. Mr. Dawkins handles the brews, not me." His eyes flicked to hers, then away, and Miss Marple thought of young Sally Brown, a maid who had stammered denials about a broken vase, only to confess when pressed with gentle persistence. "I'm sure you don't," she said soothingly. "But you were there late, cleaning a spill, you said. It must be hard, working in such a place, with so much at stake. Mr. Brewer, I hear, could be stern. Perhaps he noticed something amiss." She tilted her head, her spectacles glinting, and let the question hang, soft as a cobweb, but strong as steel. Ned's hands clenched, and his voice rose, a note of panic creeping in. "I didn't do nothing wrong, ma'am. I cleaned the spill, like I said, and left by 10. Mr. Brewer was in the cellar, alive, I swear it. I heard him moving, barrels creaking. You know how he was." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, the way his eyes darted to the stained glass image of St. Peter, as if seeking absolution. "Of course," she murmured, her tone as gentle as a lullaby. "No one doubts your work, Ned. Though I did hear you mention something to another worker about ruined batches. Was it? Such a small thing, but it stays in the mind." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but unyielding, like a grandmother who knows a child's secret. Ned's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands, his voice muffled. "I didn't mean no harm, Miss Marple. I tampered with the ale, just the one barrel. Thought it'd teach him a lesson. Mr. Brewer, always on at me for being clumsy, threatening to sack me. I put in a bit of vinegar, that's all, to spoil it. But I didn't shoot him. I swear on my mother's grave." His voice broke, echoing in the nave, and Miss Marple's heart softened. Though her mind remained sharp, she reached out, her hand hovering near his shoulder, but not touching, a gesture of comfort, restrained by caution. There, Ned," she said softly. "A moment of spite is human, my dear boy. But tell me, what happened that night? You were there later than 10, weren't you?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes held his, searching for the truth in their frightened depths. Ned nodded, his hands trembling. "I went back, around 11. Wanted to check the barrel, make sure it wasn't noticed yet. I heard a shot, down in the cellar, and I ran. Didn't see nothing, just ran. The stain it's ink, ma'am, from a pen I broke that day. I swear I didn't kill him." His voice was a plea, and Miss Marple noted the desperation. The way his story fit the mud in the cellar, the sour barrel, the timing of the shot. She sat back, her hands folded, her mind weaving his confession into the pattern. "I believe you. Meant no murder, Ned," she said, her voice calm. "But running away, that complicates things. You must tell the inspector, my dear. The truth, even when it stings, is the only way. She thought of Tommy Pierce, who had confessed to stealing apples only when cornered, and whose honesty had spared him worse trouble. Ned nodded, his shoulders sagging, as if the weight of his secret had been a physical load. I'll tell him, M.A.A.M. I was scared. His eyes met hers, pleading, and she offered a small, reassuring smile as she rose. The church's silence seemed to wrap around them, a cocoon of truth and shadow. You've done right, Ned, she said, adjusting her hat. And mind you tell the inspector about that ink. It's a small thing, but it matters. She stepped into the aisle, her steps light but purposeful, her mind turning over Ned's confession, the tampered barrel, the shot he'd heard. A boy's spite could ruin a brew, she thought, but could it lead to murder? The stain on his cuff? The mud, the timing, they were threads, but not yet the whole cloth. Outside. The village was settling into dusk, the brewery's chimney, a dark silhouette, against the sky. Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where Inspector Craddock was sorting through reports. Miss Marple, he greeted, his eyes weary but curious. You've been at the church, I hear, chatting with young Ned. Indeed, Inspector, she replied, her smile enigmatic. He's confessed to tampering with that sour Barola boy's spite. Nothing more, he says. But he was at the brewery at 11, heard a shot, and ran. His cuff, he claims, is stained with ink, but you'll want to test it? And ask him about that night again gently. Mind. He's frightened, and frightened boys tell half-truths. Her eyes twinkled, but her voice carried the weight of certainty. Craddock's pen paused, his brow furrowing. 11, you say? That fits the doctor's timeline. And tampering could be, he's hiding more. I'll bring him in, check that stain. You think he's our man? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. I think, Inspector, that Ned's secret is but one thread. The barrel, the shot, the mud, they weave a pattern, but the killer's hand is still hidden. Check his story, and that desk in Mrs. Brewer's parlor. Secrets, you know, have a way of bubbling up, like a spoiled brew. She turned down the lane, her mind weaving Ned's confession into the tapestry, sensing that the worker's shadow, though dark, was not the only one cast over Thomas Brewer's death. Chapter 10. The Partners. Alibi. The morning in St. Mary's Mead was bright, with a breeze that carried the faint temps from the brewery, a reminder of its unyielding pulse despite the shadow of murder. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat firmly pinned and her knitting bag swinging lightly, walked toward the police station, her mind a tapestry of threads. Margaret's guarded key, Ned's confession, Silas Holt's muddy boots, and James Cutler's restless ambition. The spoiled barrel and the smear of foreign mud in the cellar tugged at her thoughts. But today, her focus was Cutler, whose vague alibi at the Red Lion had begun to unravel like a poorly knit stitch. She had urged Inspector Craddock to press him further, and now, as she approached the station, she sensed the pattern of the crime tightening, though its final shape remained elusive. Inside, the station was a hive of quiet activity, constables sorting papers and murmuring about the case. Craddock stood at a desk, his notebook open, his face etched with the strain of a puzzle with too many pieces. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression a mix of respect and wry amusement. Miss Marple, he greeted, setting down his pen. I'd wager you've got a new thread to pull. We've just had Cutler in again, and your nudge about the innkeeper paid off. Care to hear the details? He gestured to a chair, its wooden frame scuffed from years of use. I should be delighted. Inspector, she replied, settling into the chair with her usual grace, her knitting bag at her feet. Mr. Cutler's story seemed slippery, shall we say, and I've found that slippery stories often hide the most telling truths. Her eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but her voice was firm, like a needle-piercing fabric. Craddock nodded, flipping through his notebook. The innkeeper, Mr. Barnes got his memory jogged. Says Cutler was at the Red Lion, sure enough, talking with that supplier, Grayson, but he left by 10, not 11, as he claimed. That leaves an hour unaccounted for, right around the time that doctor says Brewer was shot. He tapped the page, his brow furrowed. We brought Cutler in this morning, and he's sticking to his story. Says he went straight home after the inn. But his wife only confirms he was in by 11:30, and she was half asleep, not exactly ironclad. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning to Mr. Hargreaves, the St. Mary's mead baker, whose alibi for a stolen cash box had crumbled when a neighbor recalled his late-night wanderings. An hour is a long time, Inspector, she said softly. Long enough to walk to the brewery, perhaps, or to have a quiet word in a cellar. She paused, her eyes drifting to a map of the village pinned to the wall, its lanes marked in precise ink. Did Mr. Cutler say why he returned to the brewery? Craddock leaned back, his chair creaking. That's the thing he admits he went back. Says he needed papers from the office. Some contract or other, urgent, he claims. Says he was in and out. Didn't see Brewer, didn't hear a shot. But no one saw him there, and the workers had mostly gone home by 10. He frowned, his fingers drumming the desk. He's sweating, though, more than a man with nothing to hide should. Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded over her bag. A man with ambition, Inspector, often walks a fine line. Mr. Cutler wanted expansion, did he not? And Mr. Brewer stood in his way. Papers. You say perhaps those in the office ledger, with its smudged ink and scratched-out entries. Her voice was mild, but her eyes were sharp, recalling the contract she'd glimpsed on Cutler's desk. Its London crest, a symbol of his dreams. Craddock's eyes narrowed. You're thinking the ledger's key? We've got it now, and there's a mess of numbers, deliveries delayed, costs rising, and that London deal Cutler was so keen on. Brewer's signature's missing from the contract, though Cutler swore he'd agreed to it. Looks like Brewer was stalling, maybe for good. He paused, glancing at her. You think Cutler's our man? That he shot Brewer to push the sale through? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I think, Inspector, that ambition can blind a man. But murder requires a colder heart. Mr. Cutler's shoes, you'll recall, were polished. Not muddy like Mr. Holt's or the smear in the cellar. A careful man, perhaps too careful. She thought of Mr. Clements, the village shopkeeper, who had scrubbed his boots to hide a midnight errand, only to be caught by a stray leaf in his cuff. You might ask him about those papers again, and watch his eyes. They'll tell you what his words won't. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. We'll press him harder. And we're testing that stain on Ned's cuff. Ink, like he said, but there's a trace of something else. Maybe blood. The lab's still working on it. And that barrel, definite sabotage, vinegar, and some chemical we can't yet name. He glanced at her, half expecting a revelation, but Miss Marple only adjusted her hat, her expression serene. As she stepped into the village square, the brewery's chimney loomed in the distance, a silent sentinel over the unfolding drama. She paused by the green, where children played, their laughter a stark contrast to the case's weight. Her mind wove Cutler's shaky alibi, the ledger's secrets, Ned's confession, and the sour barrel into a pattern, but the killer's hand remained hidden. Ambition could drive a man to lie, she knew, but to kill. Cutler's polished shoes suggested caution, not violence. Yet that missing hour gnawed at her, like a dropped stitch in a scarf. She made her way to the Red Lion, where Mr. Barnes, the innkeeper, was wiping down the bar. Miss Marple, he greeted, his apron stained with ale. Heard you're helping the inspector. Want to know about Cutler's night? His voice was low, wary of eavesdroppers in the half-empty pub. If you'd be so kind, she said, settling onto a stool, her knitting bag at her side. A man's memory can sharpen, I find, with a little prompting. Her smile was disarming. but her eyes were keen, noting the way Barnes hesitated, his cloth slowing. He was here, right enough, Barnes said, with Grayson, talking barley prices. Left around 10, maybe a bit before. Seemed in a hurry. Didn't finish his pint. He pointed to a corner table, its surface scarred from years of use. Didn't see him after, but the lane to the brewery's just out back. Takes 10 minutes, if you're quick. Miss Marple nodded, her mind tracing the lane's path. Its proximity to the brewery, the mud that might have clung to a man's shoes. And was it a busy night, Mr. Barnes? Many coming and going? Her question was casual, but her eyes watched his hands, steady but guarded. Fairly quiet, he admitted. A few locals, Silas Holt's mates from Lower Wick, in earlier. They left before Cutler, though. His voice faltered, and Miss Marple's mind snagged on the mention of Holt's friends. Their loyalty a thread she'd yet to fully pull. She thanked him and stepped into the lane, her steps slow as she pictured Cutler hurrying through the dusk, papers in hand, perhaps meeting Brewer in the cellar. But why a gun, and why no mud? The pattern was forming, but it lacked a crucial stitch. She resolved to tell Craddock to check the office for signs of a late-night visit, perhaps a stray paper, a smudge of ink, a trace of that foreign mud. As she turned toward home, the church clock chimed noon, its notes a reminder that time, like truth, was relentless. Cutler's alibi, she sensed, was a thread stretched thin, and one tug might unravel the brewery's darkest secret. Chapter 11. The rivals tracks the lanes of St. Mary's Mead were quiet as dusk settled. The sky, a soft bruise of purple and gold, casting long shadows over the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat slightly tilted from a day of inquiries, walked with measured steps toward the police station, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The threads of the brewery murder wove tightly in her mind. Margaret's guarded desk, Cutler's slippery alibi, Ned's confessed sabotage, and Silas Holt's bitter grudge, underscored by the telltale mud on his boots. A new piece had emerged that morning. Villagers' tip about footprints in the lane near Brewer's Best. Prints that matched the dark loam clinging to Holt's soles. This, Miss Marple sensed, was a stitch that might pull the pattern into focus, and she aimed to share it with Inspector Craddock before the day's light faded. The station was a small, sturdy building, its walls papered with notices and maps, the air thick with the scent of ink and tobacco. Craddock stood at a cluttered desk, his face drawn from hours of sifting clues that refused to align. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression brightening with the wary respect of a man who knew her visits were never idle. "Miss Marple," he greeted, pushing aside a stack of reports. "You're out late. Got another thread for me, I suppose." His tone held a trace of humor, but his eyes were keen, searching her face for the insight he'd come to rely on. "Perhaps, Inspector," she replied, settling into a chair with her usual grace, her knitting bag resting on her lap. "I've heard from Mrs. Ellis, the baker's wife, about footprints in the lane by the brewery dark mud, not the local clay, leading toward Lower Wick. It put me in mind of Mr. Holt's boots, you know, and that smear in the cellar." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her eyes were sharp behind her spectacles, like needles poised to pierce a seam. Craddock's brow lifted, and he leaned forward, his notebook already open. "Footprints, you say? We've been combing that lane, and sure enough, we found tracks fresh deep, matching the size and tread of Holt's boots. He's been dodging us, but we hauled him in this afternoon. Care to hear what he says?" He gestured to a chair near a small interrogation room, its door ajar, and Miss Marple nodded, her curiosity piqued. They moved to the room where Silas Holt sat, his burly frame dwarfing the wooden chair, his scowl as fixed as the stone walls of his brewery. His hands, rough from years of labor, gripped the table's edge, and his boots, still caked with dark mud, left faint smudges on the floor. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his eyes narrowing, though he said nothing, his silence a wall as solid as his breweries. Mr. Holt, Craddock began, his voice firm but measured. We've got footprints placing you in the lane by Brewer's Best, the night Thomas Brewer was shot. Mud from Lower Wick, not St. Mary's Mead. Care to explain why you were there, when you swore you never left the Black Bull? He leaned back, his pen poised, and Miss Marple watched Holt's face, noting the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of defiance in his eyes. Holt's growl was low, like a storm brewing. I told you, I was at the Black Bull with Jeb and Will, till midnight. Those footprints could be anyone's. Plenty of folk wear boots like mine. His voice was steady, but his fingers drummed the table, a rhythm of unease that Miss Marple recognized from Mr. Grayson, the butcher who had blustered through a lie about a rival's broken windows, only to falter under scrutiny. She spoke softly, her tone as gentle as a village breeze. Of course, Mr. Holt, friends are loyal, and boots are common. But that mud, you sits quite particular. I noticed it on your boots in Lower Wick, and it matches the smear in Mr. Brewer's cellar, where he died. A curious coincidence, don't you think? Her eyes crinkled with a smile, but they held his gaze, unyielding as a needle through cloth. Holt's hand stilled, and his scowl deepened, though a flush crept up his neck. All right, he said at last, his voice grudging. I was there, in the lane. Went to see Brewer, to have it out about that London contract. He cheated me out of it, and I wasn't going to let it lie. But when I got to the brewery, the cellar was quiet, too quiet. I looked in, saw nothing, no one. Brewer was already dead, I reckon. I didn't stay. His eyes met Craddock's, then Miss Marple's, and she noted the defiance, but also a flicker of fear, like a man who had stumbled too close to a precipice. Miss Marple tilted her head, her hands folded over her bag. A brave thing, Mr. Holt, to confront a rival so late. But you didn't call for help, or tell anyone you found the cellar empty. In St. Mary's Mead, we once had a man who saw a fire, but said nothing, fearing he'd be blamed. Silence, you know, can look like guilt. Her tone was gentle, but her words were precise, each a stitch in the pattern she was weaving. Holt's fists clenched, and he leaned forward, his voice rough. I didn't want trouble. Brewer was dead, or gone, and I wasn't about to get mixed up in it. I went home, that's all. Ask Jeb and Will, they saw me back at the Black Bull, by 10:30. His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the contradiction. His friends had sworn he never left until midnight, yet now he placed himself at the brewery and back again. Craddock's pen scratched across his notebook. Your mates lied, then, he said, his tone sharp. They said you were with them all night, and that lane's a 10-minute walk, each way, hard to make it back by 10:30, if you were there at 11, when the shot was fired. He glanced at Miss Marple, catching her nod, and pressed on. What did you see in that cellar, Holt? And don't tell me nothing. Holt's eyes darkened, and he leaned back, his arms crossed. I saw barrels, shadows, nothing else. The place was dark, and I didn't linger. If Brewer was there, dead, I didn't see him. I swear it. His voice held a note of desperation, and Miss Marple thought of Mr. Thompson, a St. Mary's Mead farmer, who had sworn he'd only passed by a stolen cart, only for his footprints, to betray his presence at the scene. She spoke again, her voice soft but insistent. And your boots, Mr. Holt, did you clean them after? That mud, you see, is so very telling. It's not just in the lane, but in the cellar, where Mr. Brewer fell. A small thing, but it weaves a pattern. Her eyes held his, and she saw the flicker of panic, quickly masked. I didn't clean nothing, Holt snapped. I walked home, that's all. Mud could have come from anywhere. But his hands betrayed him, clenching tighter, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor. The way his eyes avoided the constable's boots, as if fearing they'd find more evidence. Craddock stood, his expression grim. We'll check those tracks again, Holt, and your story better hold. You're not going anywhere till we do." He nodded to the constable, who stepped forward, and Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, her mind buzzing with the new thread as she stepped into the evening air. The village was cloaked in twilight, the brewery's chimney a dark silhouette against the fading light. She paused by the lane, her eyes tracing the path to Brewer's Best, where the footprints had been found. Holt's story, she thought, was half-truth, like a scarf knit with uneven wool. He had been at the brewery, but his claim of an empty cellar rang false, too convenient, to clean. She recalled Mrs. Carter's son, who had sworn he'd only passed by a vandalized shop, only for his muddy shoes to tell a different tale. She found Craddock outside, lighting a cigarette, his face weary. "Miss Marple," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke, "you've got a nose for this. Holt's lying, or half-lying. Those footprints put him at the scene, but no gun, no blood on him. What's your take?" She adjusted her hat, her smile enigmatic. "My take, Inspector, is that Mr. Holt's grudge is real, but his hands may be cleaner than we think. A man so blunt might confront, but would he shoot and slip away? Check the lane again, and the cellar's shadows something was there, or someone, when he looked, and ask his friends why their stories shifted. Loyalty, you know, can stitch a lie as tightly as truth." Her eyes twinkled, but her voice carried the weight of certainty as she turned toward home. The church clock chimed 7, its notes a reminder that time was unraveling the brewery's secrets, one thread at a time. Holt's tracks, she sensed, were a bold stitch, but the killer's hand was still hidden, and the pattern of Thomas Brewer's death was not yet complete. Chapter 12. The Final Thread. The soft glow of lamplight spilled from the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting a warm halo over the rose bushes that framed her garden. Inside, she sat in her chintz armchair, her knitting needles clicking, with the steady rhythm of a metronome, each stitch a counterpoint to the thoughts weaving through her mind. The brewery murder had knotted the threads of St. Mary's mead into a tangled skein. Margaret's bruise and locked desk, Cutler's slippery alibi, Ned's sabotage and panicked flight, Silas Holt's muddy boots and half-truths, the sour barrel, the foreign mud, the burned papers, all were stitches in a pattern that now, in the quiet of her parlor, began to form a clear design. She set her knitting aside, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, and resolved to share her conclusions with Inspector Craddock before the village clock struck another hour. The police station was hushed, its usual bustle subdued by the late hour. Craddock, his desk littered with reports and a half-empty cup of tea, looked up as Miss Marple entered, her straw hat in hand and her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice weary but warm, "I was just about to send for you. We've got new pieces, Ned's cuff, the desk, Holt's tracks. But I confess, the puzzle's still a muddle. Care to untangle it?" He gestured to a chair, his eyes hopeful. Knowing her knack for seeing the whole cloth where he saw only threads, she settled into the chair, her movements as deliberate as her thoughts. "I've been knitting, Inspector," she said, her voice soft as a village breeze, "and knitting, you know, is all about patterns. The brewery case is much the same threads of ambition, fear, and spite, all knotted around a single act. I believe I see the pattern now, though it's a sad one." Her eyes twinkled, but her expression was grave, and Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "Let's start with the threads," she began, her hands folded over her bag. "Mrs. Brewer, with her bruise and locked desk, hides a secret perhaps, a strain in her marriage, or a fear of what Thomas's papers might reveal. But her alibi, though solitary, holds, and a bruise, while telling, is not a gun. Mr. Cutler's ambition burns bright, and his alibi wobbles an hour, unaccounted for. Papers fetched in haste. Yet his shoes, so polished, bear no trace of the cellar's mud, and ambition, while fierce, lacks the coldness of murder. Mr. Holt's grudge is bold, his footprints damning, but his bluntness and his brewery's modest success suggest a man who shouts rather than shoots. Craddock nodded, his brow furrowed. And Ned Riley. His tampering with the ale, his presence at 11, that stain on his cuffets, more than most can account for. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice softening. Ned is our not, Inspector. A young man, frightened, resentful, caught in a small act of spite that grew larger than he intended. Let me weave it for you. She paused, her eyes distant, as if seeing the brewery's shadows anew. Ned tampered with the barrel, a boy's revenge for Mr. Brewer's threats to sack him, but Thomas, meticulous as he was, noticed the sour batch. I suspect he confronted Ned that night, in the cellar, where secrets ferment as surely as ale. She leaned forward, her voice steady. Ned's story returning at 11, hearing a shot, running his truth in it, but not the whole. The burned papers in Mrs. Brewer's fireplace, those fragments mentioning debts and Ned, suggest Thomas had learned something more. Perhaps Ned owed money, or had taken something hops barley, a trifle to sell. Thomas, a man of principle, would not abide theft or sabotage. He challenged Ned, and Ned, panicked, with a revolver, perhaps kept for protection, in a rough trade, fired. Craddock's pen scratched rapidly, his eyes narrowing. The cuff stain its blood, Miss Marple, not just ink. The lab confirmed it this afternoon, though it's faint, mixed with ink, as he claimed. And we found a revolver, hidden, in a flour sack in Ned's lodgings above the baker's. Matches the caliber of the bullet that killed Brewer. Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursing slightly. Poor boy. A moment of fear, a pull of the trigger, and a life undone. I recall young Tommy Pierce, who broke a window in a fit of temper and hid the stone, thinking it would erase his guilt. Ned's sabotage was his stone, but the shot was his ruin. She paused, her eyes softening. He fled, Inspector, but not far. His confession in the church was half the truth. He admitted the tampering, but not the shooting, fearing the noose. The mud in the cellar, the timing, his presence, it all fits. Craddock leaned back, his face grim. We'll bring him in again, confront him with the gun and the blood. Holt's tracks, though they still place him there. Could he have been involved? Miss Marple shook her head, her smile faint. Mr. Holt's grudge was loud, his footprints clear, but his heart is in his brewery, not in murder. He went to confront Thomas, found the cellar empty so he thought, and left, his pride bruised, but his hands clean. His friend's lies were loyalty, not conspiracy. And Mrs. Brewer's desk, Inspector, did you find the papers? Craddock nodded, pulling a folder from the desk. We got a warrant this morning, found a letter half burned, from Thomas to Margaret, mentioning Ned's debts and a threat to expose him. Seems Brewer suspected Ned was skimming supplies, selling them on the side. There's also a note refusing the London sale cutler's dream, but Brewer's line in the sand. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, the final stitch falling into place. There it is, Inspector. Ned's desperation, Thomas's discovery, a confrontation in the cellar. The sour barrel was Ned's first crime, but the revolver was his last. You'll find, I think, that he acted alone, driven by fear of ruin. She rose, adjusting her hat, her knitting bag light in her hand. A sad pattern, but a clear one. Craddock stood, his expression a mix of awe and resolve. We'll have Ned in tonight. If he confesses, it's thanks to you, Miss Marple. You've a way of seeing what we miss. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. I only see what people are, Inspector. A village is a small world, but its hearts are as deep as any city's. Watch Ned's hands when you question him. They'll tremble, and the truth will follow. She stepped into the night, the village cloaked in starlight, the brewery's chimney, a silent shadow. As she walked home, her needles resumed their clicking in her mind. The final thread of Thomas Brewer's murder woven into a tapestry of human folly, spite, fear, and a single, fatal shot.